Hi, everybody, and welcome to another great Teentober program in honor of Hispanic Heritage Month. This is Anime Latinidad, where we will be discussing the impacts of anime on Latin American cultures and how Latin American cultures have impacted anime and manga. My name is Rebecca. I am the librarian 3 at the Greenbelt branch, and my pronouns are she and they. And I am here with my colleague, Maria Vivar Guzman from Hyattsville, who's a librarian there, and Darlene Reyes, who's a librarian too at the Beltsville branch. Welcome, everybody. So we're just gonna jump right in because we're all really excited to talk about this topic. So I grew up in downstate New York, outside New York City. It's a very, very diverse area. There's people literally from all over the world, but there's a lot of Latine people, particularly from Puerto Rico, El Salvador, and Mexico. So I grew up going to like the Puerto Rican Day Parade, which was like a really huge, amazing thing, and really fell in love with Mexican culture because you have bodegas on every corner and bachata, blaring out of people's cars, and it just becomes a part of your life. I'm very interested in the history of Mexico, particularly the indigenous history, ecology. And whenever I see a huge fandom for shonen anime in Mexico and in Chicana and Chicano teens in South Texas, it's very exciting to me. I did teach Spanish-speaking middle schoolers, primarily from Guatemala and Honduras, for 5 years. So I got to know what they really like to do. And I've learned that Funimation added over 1,000 hours of Spanish dubs late last year. So Maria, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Maria. I'm again with the high school branch. I was born in Mexico, so Spanish is my first language. So for us, anime was a huge thing growing up. Telemundo was our best friend. We would wake up early and watch Dragon Ball Z in Spanish. And from there, it was pretty exciting when we would see anime in English coming back home from school. So it's a huge part of our culture. It was a family affair. So I know some of my parents, what they initially thought were cartoons in Mexico it turns out to be they were anime that they saw back in the 70s and 80s. So I'm very excited to talk about this today.
All right, and Darlene, do you want to just tell us a little bit more about yourself and your background?
Yes, so my name is Darlene, again from Beltsville, and I was born here in the United States, but my parents are from El Salvador. I also grew up watching a lot of anime, though it was mostly in English, I guess part of the Toonami lineup on Cartoon Network. But it was really interesting because when my brother came from El Salvador, we realized that we had kind of grown up watching a lot of the same anime because the same things that I guess had been exported to the United States had also been exported to Latin America as well. And I guess the other thing I really wanted to get into is sort of why we decided to name it Latine, or why we say Latine versus Latino, Latina. And so the reason why we do that is because they are supposed to be gender neutral terms for people of Latin American descent. So as I guess a lot of people who would have taken Spanish already know, there is a masculine and feminine forms of a lot of words. And so when you are describing yourself, you would say it in a gender term that you are a Latino or Latina. And obviously in order to be more, I guess, open with that sort of, I guess, the way that people term themselves, then we created a whole new word that was more so Latine or Latinx, depending on, I guess, what side of things you take. The X felt very Americanized. So there are some people who don't feel like using Latinx, and in turn will use something like Latine, which feels more it feels like it falls more in line with the Spanish language. And I guess the other thing I really wanted to touch on before we really get into this conversation is that there are a lot of countries in Latin America that people don't really like people of these countries, people don't really consider Latin people, but they are because they are part of Latin America. And those would be Haiti and Brazil. And then dependencies like French Guiana, Guadeloupe, Martinique, Saint Barthélemy, and Saint Martin. Because again, Latin America encompasses all of these countries that also have, that speak languages that have like Romance, basically that speak Romance languages. So that's why we wouldn't consider something like Belize a part of Latin America. So I guess it really depends on who you're talking to. But they were colonized by, I want to say it was Great Britain or like England. So one of their primary languages is English, and that's why they would not be considered part of Latin America.
Thanks so much for unpacking that for us. You know, my husband's family is from Guyana, British Guyana. And so I'm very keen on some of these differences, but I think a lot of people at home may not have realized that. So I think we should just jump right into what is popular in terms of Spanish anime, in terms of dubs and subs. It's not a secret that I am a massive JoJo's Bizarre Adventure fan. And I spend a lot of time in like fan groups on social media. So I meet people from all over the world who are really into JoJo, particularly like tween age. So I meet a lot of people from Indonesia, for example, but then I also meet a ton of people from Mexico who are like Mexican teens who are super, super into it. And that's how I learned that Death Note is still insanely popular in Mexico, particularly. And that a lot of native English speakers like myself, it can be helpful to use Spanish dubs to help learn the Spanish, especially if it's something you've watched obsessively in English. Like for me, that would be like Cowboy Bebop, where I've seen it so many times that I kind of like know it by heart. So if I was to see the Spanish, I'd be like, oh, that's how that is phrased, or, you know, that's what that word is for. And then you start to pick up on words that are used frequently that maybe you don't know. So then you get a little more curious and learn about it. Maria, what did you want to add about what's really popular?
Yeah, a huge one. I went to visit family in like 2010, and a lot of the posts in the mercados, in the markets, it was a lot of Naruto. And there was like a lot of bootleg Naruto DVDs as well. So even like family members are just like, oh yeah, I know Naruto. And like they knew the hand signs. It was like such a huge part. And even like Pokemon, like that one was it's still pretty big. Like there's a lot of like Pikachu merchandise that continues to be big in Latin America. I was pretty surprised when I started seeing I guess like even like the younger teens, because Pokemon's still around, and Naruto is still very much alive through Boruto, the spin-off series. But it's really exciting to see that. But even like another popular one that I was surprised by when I spoke to my parents, was one that came out in the 70s and 80s, and it was actually part of my childhood. And I actually met some teens here at the branch who knew Meteoro, which is Speed Racer, which is just like a huge one. And it like shocked me. My parents knew what it was, and it was on TV when they were in Mexico City. So it's like another one that was also just like very popular. And even like the music for all of these, like especially like Speed Racer, it's very iconic. So even in like older cartoons like Dexter's Laboratory, they do kind of like a short spin-off of Speed Racer. It's like like it's really cool, especially with the music that everyone connects to. So it's always been interesting, especially with like all the movies that have been coming out, Naruto, Dragon Ball Z, they're massive.
That's really cool that like musical motif is like so iconic, and that it, you know, it's kind of like meaningful. I can definitely tell you that I still know all the words to the original Speed Racer opening. So, Darlene, what did you want to add about popular anime?
I would probably echo Maria's I guess what Maria said about like how popular anime is in Latin America, particularly certain series like Naruto. I still see people talking about it even now. It is just insanely popular. And I think even some that we consider really popular here in the United States are really popular in Latin America. Like I want to say Demon Slayer is also really popular in Latin America, but I wanted to talk more about some of the older popular anime because when my like I said, when my brother came from El Salvador, there was not much that we could really bond over in terms of our like experiences and our childhood. But one of those things was anime, and it was mostly through Dragon Ball Z because it was still airing when he came, and so we would watch it in English. But I think he also, I don't know that I can definitively say this, but I feel like Latin America sometimes gets things, I think, before we do. Or maybe it had started airing before it started airing in the United States. There was a lot of plot points that he like already knew before they were like airing in the United States, which I thought was really interesting. Sailor Moon being another like property, anime property was popular in Latin America. And I think since I've gotten into it, into like reading more about like anime in Latin America, I realized that there was a lot of censorship issues that we dealt with in the United States that they didn't in Latin America. And there's this really good YouTube video that kind of breaks it down. So I don't want to like talk at length about it. And I think it was like, you know, anime in Latin America, but essentially because of limited resources, they didn't have anyone to really go in and kind of like scrub anything out. And for them, it was just like whatever, however it is, that's just like how we're going to air it, which I thought was really interesting because I feel like it's one of those situations where limited resources actually is a benefit, I think, to the country, because then they're really getting this like work of art in its like original intended form rather than what we got, which famously we know that for the US Sailor Moon, two characters that were meant to be in a relationship were dubbed as cousins, which, yeah, I think even like as a kid, picking up on the subtext of their relationship, which shouldn't have been subtext, it was very much open, but subtext in the US version, I'm finding it really strange that cousins would be that close. But yeah, and then I think the other thing I really wanted to discuss, because I don't know if you guys are aware of it, but in Latin America, I didn't realize just how popular something like Saint Seiya was, which is a really old like anime from the 80s. I say really old, the 80s aren't really that long ago, but yeah, I think it's just really interesting the things that kind of found extreme popularity in Latin America versus the US, because I think that Saint Seiya never really made the big splash here in the United States the way that it did in Latin America. I know that Netflix now has a sort of like, is it an adaptation? What would you say, like when they bring it back essentially? Yeah, like another version of it. And so maybe that's introducing it to like a newer generation. But yeah, I don't think that it ever kind of reached that same level of popularity that it holds, I think, in Latin America.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. And ouch for the 80s being a long time
I
ago.
know, I'm sorry, I tried to catch myself.
That's okay. I will tell you that there's just so much wildly good anime from the 80s and the 70s really that I watched when I was a kid in the 80s, and to me they were just cartoons, but it was all actually anime. And I definitely vibe with what Maria was saying about going to the mercado. So I was in Reynosa last year, and I wasn't shocked by like DBZ and Naruto just like everywhere, every product, every like bucket hat and bag and anything you could think of. But I did see that also what was super popular was Kimetsu no Yaiba, Demon Slayer. And then
Mhm.
also My Hero Academia, which is, really giving One Piece a run for its money as like most popular ever. So
Yeah,
great.
not to like veer us off topic too much, but I think in like researching more for this program, I just realized how popular like male action anime is worldwide, but specifically in Latin America, because it would be like the ones that you just listed, like Demon Slayer and My Hero Academia and Naruto. And I feel like those feel very like male
Shonen.
centric. Yeah, shonen,
Mhm.
that's what it is.
Yeah.
But yeah, just I don't know, really interesting, especially because I know that what I gravitated towards was actually like more Sailor Moon and Card Captors and Tokyo Mew Mew, like those kind of really like hyper feminine shows. But yeah, as a whole, it's really shonen that's more popular worldwide.
That's true. It's kind of interesting, like why is that more saleable, or why do we just like that more? Yeah, very, very interesting. And actually the last time I was in Rio Grande Valley, Texas, and I was talking to like teens, like at the Korean fried chicken places, and they're all wearing Jujutsu Kaisen shirts, and they're like obsessive with Jujutsu Kaisen, which is another shonen kind of borderline horror. Like it's very that, and maybe that's just the flavor of the moment. And you never know, maybe like Magical Girl or like something like Bubblegum Crisis, where it's just like crime fighting cybernetic ladies are going to become like the new genre pretty soon. So you just never know.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but also when similar, Darlene, when I was looking some of this information up, Magic Knight Rare was extremely popular in Mexico, and it didn't catch on here either. Like Clamp had more success with Cardcaptor here in the States. So I thought that was also interesting, but it's, I guess, changing what the hero or heroine looks like. It's the journey that I guess it's typically more popular in shonen, which we've gone to see with Sailor Moon with our main heroine. So yeah, it's very interesting.
Mhm. Well, that's a good segue into talking about, since we just kind of talked about what anime is really popular, we should talk about like manga, best-selling and most popular Spanish manga. So I know that ironically, so I know much more about what's happening in Mexico just because I have family that are like in proximity there, and I keep track of like the Mexican news and stuff like that. But I know that Death Note is like one of the best-selling Spanish language mangas. Naruto is probably the biggest one, but one that I'm really interested about is Bleach. So I love Bleach. I'm so here for the new Thousand Year War Blood arc. I'm so excited to see my man Ichigo back in action. And but one thing that struck me was, first of all, they had a Latino character on the show who was using a lot of Spanish language. So as we know, Japanese people are really quite keen on preserving other people's language. So it's said with a Japanese accent, but they have an entire alphabet that's devoted just for foreign words. So, I think American audiences are familiar with the fact that Japanese language involves a lot of English because it's just kind of cool to do that, but also German, French, and Spanish, which I didn't know as much about. So I really loved in Bleach in the Hueco Mundo arc, where like everything is very much Latin American influences. There's the Espada, like they went to great lengths to sort of preserve some Spanish language terminology. And then like some of the like special attacks or things that were also using Spanish language. And then there are a lot of interesting motifs too. I think just the whole idea of like revolving around Shinigami, like death is such a big part of life in Mexican culture. And I was really thrilled just to see that some of these motifs are being picked up and used. And I wonder if it was so great and so popular in Bleach, why are we not seeing it in other, anime and manga that are coming out? So, but hopefully that is changing. Maria, what did you want to add?
It's kind of like a sleeper in some way, but My Hero Academia, it blew up here in the States, but it's also another one that's blowing up even more in Mexico. Like talking to my cousin, it's just like a lot of teens are gravitating to it more, especially with the new arcs coming, because it's very similar to Naruto in that way. It's like starts pretty wholesome, but now we're getting into some very serious arcs where we deal with politics, we deal with death, and it's very, and I think it's the same imprint in Mexico, Panini and Chapultepec in Mexico City. But I think it's just that general, like the good versus bad. I mean, we saw it with Dragon Ball Z with the popularity there. I mean, even when the new movie came out, I think a month or two ago, TikTok was like, my feed was like a lot of like Latino families going with their dads to go see the movie because they were so excited to see it. And it's the same thing. It's just like a lot of the characters, I mean, Naruto with Zabuza, and even with My Hero and We Meet Stain, like none of the characters are black and white. There's so much gray. And I think that's what appeals so much to the Latino culture, or especially Mexico, more than anything Mexico, because I am more acquainted with what's popular there right now. But all of the actions with these characters typically have the big answer to the why. It's just like we meet oh, Rebecca, I might ask you to help me out. I don't know why I forgot his name. Tamura. He's a current bad guy. I forgot his name all of a sudden.
In Naruto?
No, in My Hero.
Oh, I don't watch it.
Oh,
Not yet.
okay. Shigaraki. That's the name.
Oh, okay.
Shigaraki. We got to see his background kind of develop in the manga, and it's becoming this huge thing as to like why he's become like a villain. So I think that all of that is just like why it's become so popular lately.
That's kind of interesting. It reminds me of what Darlene was talking about, where she was noticing like the proliferation of shonen as being super, super like the dominant popularity. But maybe it's not that it's just like boy characters or even the action, although the action is, we're here for it. We are here for that. But maybe it's more about character development and the arcs. And, I know that Attack on Titan is also really wildly popular. And Aaron Yeager is a perfect example of, how things are just not always what they seem. And maybe people are just looking for more of that surprise and that kind of like, I don't know, that satisfying, like, oh, it burns to find this out type of thing. And, it would be, again, as Darlene was saying, it'd be really nice to see that with in a more feminized kind of environment, or with more female or femme presenting characters. So that's really cool. Darlene, what did you want to add about popular Spanish manga?
Yeah, so that's one of the things that I feel like I'm not that well versed in, because I don't really, I read some things in Spanish, but I don't think I've ever read much Spanish manga per se. But in researching for it, I thought it was very interesting that I didn't see this sentiment like everywhere. So I would probably want to like do my more further research on it. But it was this idea that like the Spanish translations are very standardized. And, I think anyone who knows much about like Latin America would know that everyone sort of has their own like colloquialism and just way of speaking. So I find it really interesting to think like how a country like Japan that's exporting, their anime and their manga to different countries, and how they kind of deal with those sort of cultural like nuances in each of those countries. Like with the Spain standardized Spanish translation really hit or really evoke the meaning they're trying to evoke, in Puerto Rico or in Mexico, or do they have like a more localized translators in those countries? I don't know. I just thought that was really fascinating, because language is, heavily important to all these countries. And so even for us in the United States, when certain like onomatopoeias or phrases would used to be translated from Japanese to English, sometimes I just felt like there was something missing, because in Japan, that phrase would be different. And I think that they tried to find like an English equivalent to it. And that would kind of be like, is that what they were trying to say? Or like, does that carry the same weight? And I don't know, it got me thinking about that when I was looking into what translations in Spanish must be like.
That's a really interesting wrinkle. Because yeah, there is always something that's like lost in translation. But arguably when it's done with care and with real true interest, I find that, a translation can actually like liberate a work and actually kind of like elevate it in certain ways. So I really need to brush up on my Spanish reading skills, which are woefully behind my speaking skills, which are not that great in the first place. So, but I really am interested to read some Spanish manga, and actually it's been very difficult for me to get. So I usually do the collection development for our seed collection at the pop-up location at the Space in Beltway Plaza Mall in Greenbelt. And we have a ton of Spanish speaking families that come there. And so people are always asking for Spanish language books for all ages. And one thing that they really want is manga in Spanish. And it's kind of disheartening to see how little is available. I know that COVID has something to do with that, like things that were available before are not available now, or they're on hold or whatever. But it would be great to see so much more of that, given that we have such a huge amount of people speaking Spanish in this country.
Yeah, and
So,
I also, I mean, to add to that, and hopefully there's more Spanish language mangas like circulating in the US, but I do think that a lot of parents that want their kids to retain sort of that bilingualism and like their English and Spanish, I really think that they should encourage their kids to read more manga in Spanish, because I think that graphic novels kind of pique people's interest and it keeps their interest as well. And so if you can have something that's already very interesting to them, and then it has like a lot of dialogue in Spanish, and it's not, I don't want to say bogging down in terms of like exposition or whatever, because that's really important, right? Like in a novel. But when you're trying to get a child to like be interested and like retain their Spanish, like I do think that graphic novels and mangas kind of can fill a void there. So yeah, I actually echo your sentiments then, that I do hope that we get more Spanish language graphic novels and mangas.
yeah, absolutely. And I can definitely tell you, as having been a teacher of ESL students whose primary language was Spanish, and then being their librarian also, is, I would give them like books that were like, we call them flip books, because on one side they'd be all in Spanish, and then you'd literally flip the book over and it would be in English. And that was one of the best tools for helping my students acclimate to the English language, was giving them any kind of graphic literature, any kind of graphic novel that was in English, because you can interpret so much without needing the language, and then start to fill in things as you go. So I would agree. I would think that would be a great way to retain your native language skills, is just by continuing to read in that language in a method that is really like perfect for delivering that kind of multimodal learning and access. Very cool. So yeah, please, publishers, publish more Spanish manga. Please do it. You'll make lots of money. I do want to talk a little bit about Latine anime characters. Not that there's a ton of them, but I think we all have a few favorites. So for me, my favorite is definitely Sado-san Yasutori from Bleach. He's from Mexico, and his father was a boxer and taught him how to box. And then he gets this like huge giga arm is like his power, his like big brazo, and all of his moves are like in Spanish. And he's like very notably like brown and like guapo. And I don't know, I really, really like Sado. He kind of has that like Jotaro kind of like coolness to him, but he's definitely nicer than Jotaro. So he's kind of a perfect character, really. Y'all should check it out. And then I'm less familiar with this, but I know that people are obsessed with Yuri on Ice. So I was doing some looking at, there's a character, Leo de la Iglesias, who is a ice dancing choreographer from Mexico, who like tried to have their own career, but unfortunately, like one of their performances didn't go well, and so they turned to this instead. Yuri on Ice has got a lot of diversity in it, so that's also very cool to see. In my digging for Latine representation in anime, I discovered Seis Manos on Netflix. And Seis Manos is, I guess you could argue like, well, that's not anime because it didn't come from Japan. I'm like, well, yeah, but Castlevania and even the Boondocks and things like that, they're so anime inspired that they kind of go along there. So Seis Manos is really unusual, inventive. It kind of gives me like Hunger Games type of vibe where it's just like, it's set in Mexico and the drug cartels are like in charge of things, and there's clones and there's fighting and there's all this different stuff. And I saw that some of the people who are the creators are Latino. So I haven't seen it yet, but it looks really, really interesting. I don't know. Yeah, it's like gonna be interesting to see like that topic. Like, is this just gonna be another Mexico is just full of drug cartels, or is this going to be like a really cool story based on somebody's personal experiences that they turn into like this futuristic, apocalyptic, kind of thing? So, but I know Maria, you have a lot more information on Latino representation in anime characters, so go for it.
Well, I kind of focused on the one, and actually the one you just talked about, it might go on my list because I'm curious about it now for Seis Manos. But the one I focused on was Greiger from Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds, which kind of shocked me, like at least the first time I saw it a few years ago, which Yu-Gi-Oh! Was a huge popular show, and this was like one of the other spin-offs, I guess. And we actually meet Greiger, who is a dueler, and he's an assassin as well. And he later becomes a dark signer, which is like another part of the arc for his life. He is South American. He's actually from a village that was located in the Nazca Desert in Peru. So this is like someone who is like gigantic. He's like more than 6 feet tall. He's probably like 6'4". He towered over everyone, especially like some of the signers that they're like children. So it's like seeing the interesting like size differences, but his village was destroyed, and this kind of brings me back to like maybe why I think certain anime or manga is popular, because a lot of some Latin American countries there's a huge class difference. There's not really a middle class in some countries, and Greiger actually comes from this village that was destroyed because they were doing experiments around the land there. And he really wants vengeance. He wants to just figure out who did this. He lost his family. Everyone was gone during the explosion. He duels for his village. He duels for his family. And this is a character who is just very respectful of other duelists, even though he does have his one-track mind of wanting to seek revenge. But he has a huge heart, and he mourns for his family. And it's Yusei, the main duelist in Yu-Yu, who kind of helps him out. And he finds out who destroyed his family, and he was actually working for them this whole time. But what was interesting with this, and it's what Darlene mentioned earlier, to censorship with this arc is interesting because the way we see him, at least in the States, he kind of just disappears into like this pit, but like in the Japanese version, he's hung. He is hung to death. And you can see it when he like is let go and becomes like overtaken by a god who essentially is the main like culprit for the destruction of his village. And with help from Yusei, this is a character who's able to fight and not destroy everyone around him, even when he is possessed. So this was like a character who's just like very like he was a teddy bear at the end of the day, and it was just like hard to kind of like see him go through all of this. And I know Darlene's going to go into more like what characters are usually depicted as, especially when they're Latin characters or Latin.
Yeah, so I guess some of the characters that I remember from watching anime growing up that were Latine, the biggest one I think being Luffy from One Piece, because he is Brazilian. It does establish that pretty early on in the show. And so technically he would be a Latine character in that sense. And then I remember like, I want to say his name was pronounced like Io from Saint Seiya, who was like a anime character with a Chilean heritage. But one thing I was like noticing as I was like looking more into Latinate characters in Japanese anime was the fact that a lot of these characters tend to be fighters. They tend to be fighters. And so I don't know, I just felt like that was really interesting. And I think it started to make me feel like maybe that's why I never felt like any sort of true affinity or like closeness or have you to a lot of these Latinate characters, because that's typically not the character that I don't know. It's not the characters that tend to be like my favorite characters in series. And so but yeah, I mean, it's like very often like they will be like fighters, they'll be like boxers. And honestly, a lot of them do have revenge plots as well. But yeah, I just thought that that was really interesting. Like there's Pepe Iglesias from Megalobox, who's a Mexican boxer. There's another one, I want to say from Ashita no Joe, Carlos Rivera, who's also a fighter. And yeah, it was just like a trend that I just kept seeing. And again, it's one of those like really interesting things, but like there's sort of an understanding there as well, in that Japan can be a very like not isolated country, but it can be in its own way. Like it's a very homogenous country. So I can imagine that they don't have like a wide breadth of knowledge of like Latin America. And so I think that maybe vice versa, like some of the pop culture like just cultural things that have come from Latin America that's made its way like into Japan would be like wrestling and things from like Mexico, and boxing, which is really popular throughout Latin America. And so I can imagine that they would kind of take in those like I guess like those pop culture moments, and then and that's why it would be reflected in the anime that they have. I don't know if you guys kind of feel the same way about that, and maybe like trying to figure out like why it is that most of these characters tend to be fighters. But
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that that's kind of a central theme to like modern anime right now, is that you have the fighters and you have those who need to be protected sort of people, so, but I do agree with you, because I feel like that must be like the obsession for these mangakas, is that like they're very attached to like a certain kind of culture, and so then they create a character around the culture as opposed to like creating a character that comes from a culture. And yeah, I think, yeah, even my favorite Sato-san, he kind of fits into that. As you're talking, the one thing that also strikes me is like, where are the women? Where are the femme presenting people? And there's only like one Latina character that I know of in anime. I wasn't a huge fan of Black Lagoon, but I did watch it on Toonami way back. We're not going to talk about how long ago that was. But there was this character on Black Lagoon, Rosarita Cisneros. They called her Roberta, and she was a member of FARC, which for our viewers was a Colombian guerrilla army. So Colombia was like really like a battleground area between huge powers like the United States in the 1980s. And then of course there was also like the cocaine cartel that came out through there. So she talks about being like a guerrilla, and then she becomes an assassin. And she like wears a maid's costume, and she's like always praying the rosary and praying for people's sins and repenting her sins. So like that also is kind of like a stereotype, right? The Latina maid, she's super religious and Catholic, and but then it's like spun through this like lens of like, oh, but I'm also powerful because look what I do. I take lives. I decide who lives and dies. So yeah, that is kind of like a troubling problematic, way, kind of prism through which Latin American culture is being expressed through anime. So it's nice to see characters like Leo from Yuri on Ice that is none of those things. But then again, he's also, like many others in that anime, a side character. So it would be really, really nice to see a main character that's fully developed, and that is bringing like concepts of family, because that's one thing I do see also is like the familia concept being central to a lot of these characters. Like they're always trying to get vengeance because their families were killed. So maybe like sort of like no more dead dogs in children's literature. Like don't just maybe we just need to like say stop killing people's familias and like let them live and thrive. Maria, what do you think about that?
No, I mean, literally that. I think another thing too is just like, I guess, kind of like playing devil's advocate a little bit. Just like for a pop culture, I guess Mexico specifically, with boxers like way back when. No, like a couple years ago, or maybe about 2030, Oscar de la Hoya, when he kind of like was a big boxer from Mexico. And even like wrestling in Mexico is huge. So I know like a lot of folks, if they don't make it here in the US, sometimes they'll go to Mexico or they'll go to like other countries to kind of like work on wrestling abilities. I know even Rey Mysterio, who was a wrestler growing up, would also go to Mexico and come back to WWE here. So I also wonder if it's because of what kind of pushed it out to what pop culture is or was back then. So I guess that would be something else to kind of look into, or possibly was a reason for some of these characters being what they were. But it is true, at least like there's always that same background, and if it's not cartel, it's like some kind of tragic childhood.
Yeah, yeah. And it's sort of like, is this representation or is this kind of like exploitation of others' learned experience? What a great conversation. I'm so glad that that we talked about that. Thank you, Darlene and Maria, so much for all of your insight. Why don't we wrap it up by talking about maybe what we want to read? Because we all mentioned wanting to read more Spanish language manga, even though it can be a little bit hard to get your hands on. And for anybody who's watching, if you want to read Spanish language manga, I know that the library does have some things for borrowing. However, if we don't have it, we would love for you to suggest a purchase, or we could maybe get something on interlibrary loan, or possibly even off WorldCat somewhere else in the country for you to read. So please don't be shy to ask us about that. For me, I think I will, first of all, in telling Maria, I've been watching Naruto Kai because I'm not one for like the kidsy filler stuff. So for anybody who doesn't know, Naruto Kai is a greatly edited Naruto and Naruto Shippuden. It's like 76, 90-minute episodes instead of watching all of the episodes in succession. So kind of powering my way through that. And it makes me realize that I bet the manga is just dope. Like it's probably even better than the anime. And so I really just want to read the manga period. But now that I know the story so well, and some of the vocabulary like fox, and there's certain words that like are going to come up over and over again, right? Or the nine tails and things like that. So I kind of want to read it in Spanish just to kind of see how I do with it and what I can learn. And I'm really, really curious to see the onomatopoeia, how that translates in Spanish. Do they keep it in like the Spanish, the Japanese katakana, or is it going to be sort of like Englishified, or are we going to see like true to culture Spanish language onomatopoeia? So should be neat. Maria, what do you want to read?
I want to give My Hero Academia in Spanish a try. I like really am curious about that one, especially with everything developing in it. I know I tried watching Pokemon in Spanish, and that was interesting because the usual like Dragon Ball Z, the intro was translated from the Japanese version to Spanish. But with Pokemon, it was the English Pokemon theme song that was translated to Spanish. So I'm kind of curious to see that going, but I would love to give My Hero Academia a try, reading it in Spanish and watching it in Spanish.
Yeah, now I need to know, like, how do you translate, I want to be the very best, the best that ever was in Espanol. So, Darlene, what are you hoping to read next?
Yeah, so I think in the spirit of spooky season, I want to revisit Uzumaki by Junji Ito, which is kind of like this like horror manga, like a really popular horror manga. And so I think I want to read it in Spanish. I didn't realize that it was in Spanish. And so because I've read that book at least twice now, or the original manga in the English translation twice now, that'll maybe make it a little bit easier for me to read in Spanish, because I can read in Spanish. It's just I'm very slow at it because it doesn't, I'm not as comfortable with it as I am with reading English. But I think the other thing is, as I've gotten older, I feel like I tend to like more slice of life stuff. So I'm really into like, I don't know, it's like a newer manga, I want to say, but it's a man and his cat. And then there's Yotsuba, which is like follows like a little 4-year-old girl. But I feel like I'd want to read those in Spanish because I don't know, that feels very like feel good. And yeah, it would probably just kind of motivate me to like keep reading in Spanish.
That's so wonderful. I love Yotsuba and so much. Just for everybody who's watching, if you're Yotsuba is amazing. It is in our J graphic section. It's like one of the few ones that we talked about that's not in teen or adult. And I heard that it just got greenlit to be animated. So I'm really, really excited to see how that's going to go. This has been just a wonderful, wonderful conversation. I learned so much in just doing the research for this program. It's really got me fired up to learn not just about, how the anime's impact in Latin America and in Spanish language, but also in other countries. So I want to see like, where is it also popular and why? I just wanted to let everybody know that this is Teentober and we are still celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month. So speaking of Junji Ito, there is going to be a special manga and anime club watch party for the new Junji Ito horror collection. And that's going to be at the Hyattsville branch on October 5th, 4:30 to 5:30, and then again on October 19th. So if you can't make one, you could probably make the other. I will be hosting Mac Party, our virtual program, which is Spooky Season Edition. That's going to be on October 18th, Tuesday, from 4:30 to 5:30. Again, all you're going to do is like log in on your phone or your Chromebook. You don't have to like go to a branch, but we're going to be doing a lot of introspection into horror, especially like why horror is so big in Japanese culture. And then again, at the Hyattsville branch is going to be lit this month. So there is going to be a special cosplay workshop sponsored by Artway Alliance, who will be learning to make different kinds of like cosplay props with a person who's like a for real cosplayer. So that's going to be amazing. Then also that same day, we have our cosplay parade. So if you like to cosplay, if you'd like to come to the branch between 12 and 5, I believe, and in cosplay, we will have a special, 3D printed gift for you. And that's going to be Saturday, October the 22nd. The cosplay workshop itself is from 1 to 2:30. Thanks everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your Teentober and your Hispanic Heritage Month. And yeah, keep watching anime, keep reading our manga, come to the library. Your teen librarians really want to talk about it with you. So thanks everybody.